As we talked about in some recent videos, the NBA right now from a talent perspective is just out of control. I've talked about possible expansion coming up for the league because there's just so many really good players and really good teams, and that really speaks to just the overall parity of the league right now. Now, when I say parity, I've talked about that with this upcoming season, specifically in the Western Conference. There's a ton of really good teams in the West. The East is a little bit more top heavy, but the overall talent there is very, very clear. We've talked about that for this season, but in general, the last couple of seasons have been really interesting because we had this era, right, where for the entirety of the 2010s, basically, it was like, okay, LeBron's going to be in the finals. There's going to be some team in the West that's going to meet them there. And then as we got to the middle of the decade, it's going to be Steph and LeBron, and then obviously KD mixed in there as well. And we had these like, not really dynasties, but like mini dynasties, right? And there were these teams that would kind of rise up and then fall back down. But for the most part, it was LeBron and then Steph, and then those two guys going back and forth. And now we're kind of in this new situation where, because Steph is still very good, LeBron is still very good, but they're not just guaranteed to get to the finals anymore. Because of that, we're seeing those teams that typically maybe would rise and fall and maybe get pushed back down by the LeBron teams, the Steph teams. Now they're going all the way up. Now they're actually winning titles. They're making finals. And the parity in terms of who the contenders are on a year-to-year basis is really intriguing and really interesting to me. When you go back to the 2020 title with the Lakers winning in the bubble, that was kind of an out-of-nowhere situation. But again, that was LeBron again. 2021, you've got Milwaukee not coming out of nowhere, but really finally making that final ascension. And then they end up facing Phoenix in the finals, who had just gotten Chris Paul, and then Devin Booker was there. And we didn't think about Phoenix as a contender the year or two prior to 2021. And then all of a sudden they're in the finals. They're up 2-0. They're 2 games away from winning the title. And then all of a sudden Phoenix is a contender. Milwaukee's a contender. Then you go to the following season, and this Boston team that looked like a complete disaster. Like, we were having real conversations on this channel. People were having these conversations elsewhere about the possibility of the end of the Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum era, that being a real thing. Trading one of those guys away would be trading Jaylen Brown away. It wouldn't be trading away Jason Tatum. We were talking about that. That was with Ime Udoka there. The first half of that season and the year that they made the finals, they looked terrible. And then they turned it around, and all of a sudden now they're this big contending team, making trades, bringing in Kristaps Porzingis, bringing in Drew Holiday, really pushing their chips to the center of the table for this window. And we had the reemergence of the Warriors, who were kind of dormant there for a few seasons as they went through some injury stuff and reshuffling and reshaping the roster after KD left. And all of a sudden they were a team in the finals as well. And then you go to last year, and this Denver team that we knew was good. We knew Jokic was good, but they either had a little bit of bad luck with, Jamal Murray getting hurt, or they kept reshaping the roster by bringing in guys like Aaron Gordon. They never really were able to fully put it together, and all of a sudden they're winning the title. And then of course Miami gets sprinkled in there all the time. We've got Philadelphia always trying to figure some things out. And it feels like for the entirety of the 2010s, the circle of contenders was like 3, 4, 5 teams. And those 3, 4, 5 teams didn't really change a whole lot for that entire decade. It might have changed in terms of the actual teams, but in terms of like, okay, we have the LeBron team, we have the Steph team, we've got a couple of other semi-contenders outside of that, and that didn't really change that much. But it feels like now, as we're going, throughout the 2020s, as we see Steph maybe starting to decline a little bit this season, we'll see, as we see LeBron certainly declining a little bit over the last couple of seasons as he approaches his age 40 season. Now we're getting to the point where there's true parity. And it's interesting how that's going to potentially impact the legacy of a handful of different players, because you could argue pretty easily that from this season on, and really honestly the last few seasons, really from 2021 on throughout the rest of the 2020s, it's going to be significantly easier for players to win a title than it was in the 2010s, because you have 2 generational guys. You have LeBron, you have Steph, and then of course KD showing up in there as well. That's just such a difficult situation to overcome. For example, if you're Chris Paul, or if you're Giannis, or if you're James Harden, whoever, guys that didn't win a title in that time span, that in Giannis's case ended up winning it in 2021, it's going to be a lot easier now, easier quote unquote, to win a title in the 2020s. And there's going to be people that are going to be having conversations about what a title means in the 2020s compared to what a title meant in the 2010s. And to me, it's just really exciting, and it's really interesting to always have new possibilities in terms of teams that could rise up and be contenders. And it feels more attainable than ever going into a season for your team to possibly make a run to the conference finals or the finals. Obviously, we've had, some crazy runs with teams like Miami, and then Atlanta a couple years ago made the conference finals. We had Dallas beat Phoenix and make the conference finals. Those kinds of things happen periodically, but I really feel like because there's so much talent, and because there are great players, Giannis, Jokic, these guys are also fantastic, but they don't have that same kind of like, or at least to this point, that same kind of like, put me on, you guys can just climb on my back and I'm going to take you to the finals that LeBron and Steph did. And I'm really, really curious how the next handful of years are going to work out in terms of parity, because it feels like as long as you're in, you know, the top 6, obviously Miami's different, but if you're in the top 6 and you make it to the playoffs and you're a decent team, feels like you've got a real chance to make the finals. And that's got to be such an exciting time to be a fan of one of those teams, when it felt like for a decade, especially if you were in the East for the entirety of the 2010s, if LeBron was there, and he always was, he was going to make the finals. There was no path, there was no avenue until 2019 when Toronto did it, for a team with LeBron in the Eastern Conference to break through that and get to the finals. And so when you think about parity, obviously you think about a ton of talent, a lot of really good teams, but also the context of who's at the top, who's kind of setting the ceiling for, okay, no matter how good you were in the East in the 2010s until 2019, you could not get to the finals. It just wasn't a thing, and now you can. And so I guess what I'm saying is just, it's a different concept of parity, because when you first think about it, again, you think about everybody being on like kind of a similar playing field in terms of like the tiers, right? Like you've got one big tier of contenders that before might have been 3 or 4 teams, and now it's 7 or 8 teams. But the reason for that is because not that the teams at the top aren't as good as maybe some of those LeBron or maybe even Steph teams, but because everybody is on that level. Like whatever the ceiling is, whatever the top tier 1 team is, the other teams in that tier are all just as good. And I'm not sure that we've had that for a while, quite frankly, until these last couple of seasons. And I know that, you know, the Golden State and Cleveland finals were really highly rated, and we had a ton of people watching them because of the storyline of Steph and LeBron. And more recently, maybe the finals haven't had as much viewership. But for people like me that just love basketball, that love the storylines, that always want to have a new thing to pay attention to, a new team. Oh, are they going to be able to break through? Like, is Philadelphia somehow going to figure it out and break through and get to the finals this year? Are the Clippers going to figure it out somehow in the Western Conference? Is Phoenix going to get back with this crazy lineup they have? Is Chris Paul going to get a title with Golden State? It feels like there's 8 or 9 teams that have a real possibility of winning the title, of being involved in the championship chase. And that's a trend from the last couple of seasons, and one that I hope continues, because one of the complaints of all the super team stuff for the 2010s was that it felt like none of the other teams had a chance. None of the other teams wanted to compete with the Steph KD Warriors. None of the other teams in the East were particularly excited about competing with the LeBron Cavs, and they weren't really wrong about that. And I feel like now, even as good as the Nuggets were last year and these last couple of championship teams have been, it still feels like the ability to get yourself in position to win a title is easier now than it's ever been. And I don't know if that's going to continue. Maybe one of these guys is going to be like LeBron in the 2010s, and the Nuggets are just going to make the finals for 8 years in a row, or the Bucks are going to make the finals for 8 years in a row, or some other team, whether it be, you know, OKC eventually becoming this true powerhouse team. But I really feel like with the way that the league is trying to balance out power between, you know, bigger and smaller market teams, with the way that they're trying to restrict some player movement and salaries and payrolls of super teams and all that stuff, we could really be entering an era of true top tier parity, which for me would be an incredibly exciting basketball experience as an NBA fan.